Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. So, how's your day progressing? Very good. Okay. Thank you. So we have another great session, creating a resilience culture. Culture has been a big talked about topic in this event, and I think is just the right subject to carry on the day with. And it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Christophers. He's head of risk at Thames Water. Thomas has spent a year with Thames Water, but prior to that, he was with Centrica in various roles in risk. At Thames Water, Thomas is responsible for enterprise risk management, creating a framework that sits at the center of the corporate governance that helps report risks and metrics to all the stakeholders internally and externally as well. So, Thomas, it's my pleasure, and if you could come and share your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Hello there. Okay, thank you for coming. I appreciate. I'm just before lunch. Well, almost an hour before lunch, but lunch nonetheless. I did think actually Brian May was going to join us, but probably got other commitments to make rather than talking about resilience in a corporate environment. Although Queen are quite a big corporate entity in their own. For whoever's ever followed that band or is a fan, they were one of the first bands to become a sort of a corporate in their own rights to a degree. You know, their trademarks, they own all the rights. They basically control a lot of the flow of the money that comes into that entity, and rightly so. So, as I was introduced, I work for Thames Water. Actually been there for almost 2 years now. Sort of the biog's slightly out of date, but I was brought in primarily to build up a risk framework within the business. There wasn't too much there that you would call a risk framework prior to that, which probably explains why we have had a lot of recent Daily Mail style headlines within the media for water main bursts, for pollution incidents, for opaque offshore holding companies and such like, which we are, with a new executive and a new board and new shareholders in place, fixing and becoming more of a corporately social responsible partner in the communities that we serve. So without wishing to pause too much on Thames Water's history, prior to that I was with Centrica, again another utility business. They own British Gas. They're not French, contrary to public opinion. They are a British owned firm, a PLC. I held a variety of risk roles from sort of exploration and production of gas, although they don't do that so much these days, through to power, through to corporate centre. So my main job really is to embed risk processes and policies, ensure that the framework is fit for purpose and it ticks, or that probably the last time I used that phrase, the box of corporate governance requirements, Directors Act, Companies Act for the directors, and so on and so forth. I fell into risk management, so it wasn't my raison d'etre when I was growing up. I actually wanted to be a doctor, and then I wanted to be a tennis player, and I was not very good at either of those, although I never got to practice medicine. I went to make injectable drugs in Slough, but legally, for which there was less money than if you made them illegally in Slough, with no disrespect to anyone that lives in Slough. From there, I just kind of fell into project management within Centrica and then got the risk job from that. So, why are we here today? So I'm only here to talk about a resilience culture. I guess what I mean by that, so the chief exec of Saatchi & Saatchi fairly recently spoke about the death of really sort of modern business. So he's talking about the death of marketing, the death of strategy, the death of management, the death of big ideas. And what he was really getting at there was that at the moment, business seems to veer towards crisis, from crisis to another crisis. There is no sort of stable state of corporate being these days. And he used a phrase called VUCA, which you may or may not have heard of. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And that came out of the sort of the post-Cold War era in the US military to explain what was happening in sort of the East and its relationship with the West. And the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth, and how the Western entities were able to sort of work within the new world state and the new world order, with the rise of democratic, in inverted commas, Russia. And from there, I think when you look at business and the way that business has become more globally interconnected and the dependencies that we have all over the place throughout the supply chain or just, as a global footprint, it's very easy to see how things like Primark Bangladeshi shirts can suddenly become a corporate responsibility PR disaster when you're paying people in Bangladesh to make shirts for Primark. You're paying them beneath the living wage for that country. The conditions are awful, but you're a Western brand and you're trying to promote a lifestyle choice. And it brings really, for me, sort of to life that analogy of the butterfly and the earthquake. So a butterfly in Papua New Guinea flapping its wings, causing an earthquake in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and a resulting tsunami that causes widespread damage. Well, that butterfly anywhere within the corporate environment can now exist and cause that kind of damage. And that's really what I want to talk to in the next slide. So there's a professor called Professor Taleb, who I think has been a speaker here before, who expanded the theory of the black swan. So the black swan is a remote event, and he has various criteria for what he means by black swan. It should be a surprise to the observer when it occurs. And it should be a major event. And then with the observer, they should then be able to rationalise it as being something that should have been expected with hindsight. But it's a remote event. It's something that you shouldn't be expecting. It's the meteor attack. It's the downing of the national grid type of event. Something that you just think won't happen. But actually, these are sort of 1 in 100 year events, and people forget that 1 in 100 year event could be tomorrow. There's also the theory that there is a grey swan out there, and these are sort of the things that should be anticipated to a better degree than the black swan. They're the things that are probably the Carillion type disasters that are emanating out there within the corporate landscape that could actually happen. They're more likely to be the things that you'd see. And then there's just plain catastrophic loss, something that just goes wrong. It's neither a black swan, it's neither a grey swan, it's just a business usual activity that just, for whatever reason, that day has just escalated out of control. My thought on that is really that the black swan is a bit of a myth in today's sort of VUCA environment. And I've just got a few examples here just to take you through. So Beast from the East, 1 in 40 year events. We got hit with it this year. And then we also had the extreme weather in the summer. Again, another 1 in 40 year event, but we had 2 in the same year. All right, different weather events, but still a weather event in the same regard. Again, not really a black swan, not really a grey swan, just business as usual. Terrorism. Okay, the UK is slightly different in that we've had terrorism since the IRA, but actually terrorism is more widespread across Europe. Wherever you go in the globe, there is this common threat, and it takes different shapes and forms. It's no longer the bomb. It's no longer the suicide bomber. It's the person in a car or with a knife that could just be passing you by in the street. Putin, an obvious sort of catastrophic risk. Apologies to anyone that's Russian. But again, someone that's just pushing the boundaries quite a lot. Assassinations in the UK, allegedly. Cyber attacks, one of the potential forces behind Brexit, one of the potential forces behind Trump. Depending on which theory you believe, but also Trump, another sort of out of nowhere populist movement, came to force. I don't think he even really thought he was going to get into power. Certainly his team didn't. They were caught by surprise when they got into the White House. But again, just another catastrophic event that happened for the world. He's changed it. This is the world's leading superpower, China aside. And he got Donald Trump in charge. North Korea, again, a bit of saber rattling, whether you believe this was, quite the threat that it was. But again, it's a distraction. It's a piece of event that the world doesn't really need at this time, similar to sort of the Nixon era with China at the time. Brexit, again, who predicted Brexit? I imagine no one in this room, because if we'd bet on it, we'd be sitting in the Caribbean somewhere. But again, another event that happened. No one quite knows what's going to happen in March, whether it does happen in March. And then we've got the transition period to get through. For anyone living in Northern Ireland, what happens there? the consequences of any Brexit, hard, soft, no deal. There's bound to be a change in government, definitely a change in Prime Minister, a change in Minister for any of your companies that require a regulator or a specific business interest with government. All these things will change your landscape just from that one event. Cybersecurity, an easy one. Again, these things are quite widespread. They're not black swans by any stretch of the imagination. They occur far too often. BA, DLA Piper, Sony, TalkTalk, the list goes on and on. Again, more widespread and more catastrophic in terms, DLA Piper, world's largest law firm, loses control of their whole IT system. They can't bill their customers. They can't even get in touch with their clients for 2 days, more or less. News of the world, again, media, a catastrophic event for the media. Although, you can't really tell me that the editor of the News of the World didn't really know that there was phone hacking going on, but, that's conjecture at best. Enron, just an example of the financial services in general. A lot of rogue operations going on there, but not, unknown to their other compatriots in that industry. Tesco, horse meat, chickens, financial black holes. Still they're surviving though, which is quite remarkable. Share price isn't too bad. But again, catastrophic loss. Three black swan events really in the space of a few years, just for one firm. And Carillion, start of the year. So they posted their accounts, and within the corporate governance code these days, you have to fill out something called long-term viability statements. So in their annual accounts, reporting accounts, you will see their long-term viability statement that says, they're viable for the next 3 years. A matter of weeks later, they've gone down the pan. Something's clearly gone wrong there. There's obviously a corporate governance culture failure, but something's gone wrong. And again, that's probably more of a grey swan than a black swan, but a swan nonetheless. And then BP, an easy target, Deepwater Horizon, Bhopal, a whole culture there that wasn't what it was, but and certainly isn't the culture that pervades now. But they were days from collapsing, and they hold some of the largest stakes for a lot of pension funds. So not only would they go down, but pension funds will also be hit, including a widespread loss across the UK. So really, I think these black swans, grey swans, whatever you want to call them, they're part of the corporate reality these days. We are veering from crisis to crisis, and to still operate within that world, corporates need to ensure that they are resilient. It's no longer good enough just to have a risk manager that fills out a risk register, takes it to the exec and to the board every quarter and expects a bit of feedback and just to get on with it and around we go again. We need to develop systems that actually make firms resilient so that when these events do occur, not if, but when, we're able just to steer from sort of rocky road to rocky road, but keep roughly about the same and not be too thrown off course by these events. So corporate resilience itself, Scotty from Star Trek, we need to make sure that what we put in place represents some sort of living will or a recovery and resolution plan. And this is one of the sort of exponents I wish to talk to you about today, is that within companies, what we need to do is we need to firstly understand our business, and then we need to work back and say, well, actually, how long can we survive one of these scenarios? So we need to put a course into plan preparedness, and a lot of people think about business continuity in those regards, or contingency planning. But I'm thinking about going a step further than that. So when I was talking to a business continuity manager recently, he was just talking at a very granular detail about fire risk to buildings. He said, if my corporate HQ goes down, the staff navigate out through the exit and they go, practically to sit underneath a tree and wait further instruction. And you're all probably used to that in your fire drills. You go across to a certain muster point, you stay there, you have a bit of a roll call, and then you all saunter back into the office. But if you think about resilience and you think about companies keeping on going, if that HQ does burn down, what do you do with your employees? They're still underneath the tree, but their car keys are in the office, their cars are possibly in the basement car park, their wallets are in the office, because you're not supposed to stop and take your bag with you. So what do you do? How do you get those employees to the next stage? How do you get them home? How do you ensure that they're able to work the next day? Who works the next day? Who logs on to the VPN connection? And who doesn't, to make sure the thing doesn't go down? What parts of the business keep on going? And this business continuity manager was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but he said that their IT help desk was contained within the HQ that doesn't have a backup generator. So if this place goes down, the IT help desk goes down within that company. So the people logging onto the VPN who need help because the VPN is now clogging up with everyone trying to get in offline, no longer have anyone to talk to. And if their laptop's still in the office, they definitely don't have anyone to talk to. So business is sort of in a paralysis at that point. And we need to get to a point where we expand that thought out wider and broader, in that how do we make sure that business keeps on going? And if it's a case of cash flow, how do we make sure that we keep on burning through cash until a point where we can start to rebuild and get onto firmer ground? But in that interim period, in that sort of short lag phase, how do we ensure that business is still viable rather than going down the Carillion aspect of having to fold? So part of that, I think the first step we need to do is understand our business. So for Thames Water, it's very easy in this regard. I'm not talking about mapping the business, that's very hard within Thames Water. But in terms of mapping the business, what I'm talking about is the critical red lines of service. What are the things that, as a business, you have to do? So for Thames Water, we have to supply potable water to our customers. We don't get out of that. That's just that's a given. People have to drink water they're not going to become sick from, or enough supply that they're able to use. We also have to take sewage away. So we have to take the waste products away. So they're not backing up in people's houses, basements, through flooding or whatever. And we're able to treat that properly. So those are our two basic fundamentals as a business. The rest of the business can sort of waver in the ditch for all we care in this type of scenario. So the connecting new homes in housing estates to the network, that's sort of a luxury in this phase. Giving out water efficient shower heads, again a luxury. We can do without that piece of business, but we have two fundamental things that we can't do, and it'll be the same for your businesses as well. There'll be fundamental aspects of your business that means that you have to keep those things live, and to do that you have to understand the business. You have to understand what dependencies there are within your supply chain, within the business itself. If you have a server out in Chiswick, whether that supports an application that is critical for one of these critical red lines of service. And those things have to be fully understood, because you can't understand your business as you're going through a crisis or a catastrophic loss event, because by that stage it's too late. You should be firefighting, for want of a better phrase, at that point, and going through your crisis management plan rather than trying to work out what you're supposed to be saving and what you can leave to burn. You also need to have a bit of optionality. When we looked at catastrophic loss within Thames Water, we mapped out 12 key scenarios that we think would be so huge that they would take us down. So things like, terrorism or critical assets infrastructure. These are things, things like the London ring main. So within London, there's a ring main. It's not quite a circle, but that supplies all the water around the Greater London Authority. If there's an attack on that, or if there's contamination of that, London is a bit screwed for all intents and purposes for water. There's no other way of getting, apart from bringing bottled water to the Greater London area. So we need to work out really what those types of scenarios are, so that we can then start game playing and working out crisis management plans to work out what we would do in those types of scenarios, how we prepare for them, how we're resilient afterwards, and how we mitigate the potential for them to ever occur. But at the nth degree, we need to work out really what the options are should we get to the point of no return. So we have shareholders, we're not a publicly limited company, so we rely on pension funds and things to give us investment for us to use, and then eventually in a few years' time we'll be able to give them dividends. We need to understand, a bit like a pension fund really, where we go to for cash if we get in such trouble, financial trouble, that we're starting to run out of cash. Where do we go to? Can we go to markets? Well, with Brexit, that closes off the European Investment Bank, so where else can we go for cash at an affordable enough rate that we're able to get it in the first place? So that means our credit rating reference needs to be high in order to get those types of funds. We also need to work out really if we've got specific assets that are critical to our operation, well, where do we get the parts from for those? Where do we ensure we've got, again, contingency planning to ensure that those assets can keep on running? and the same with staff, and so on and so forth. So we need options that we can use to keep our business viable at the same time. We also need, ready to get to that point, is then to forget about the scenarios, because the scenarios at that point almost don't matter. You're looking really at the end game is in that what are the things you can still do as a last resort to keep on going. And the scenarios by that point aren't really the answer, because you need to work out then how to reverse stress those events. So if you need funds at the last minute, how do we get to that point? How do we know what the trigger point is to then release that? We need to start working backwards in a logical degree to say, well, actually, I understand my business, I understand what needs to happen in the event of a catastrophe, and I understand the options that I have to get back on course, but how do I get to that point? So I need to know really what my sort of KPIs or key risk indicators are in effect for the business. You know, what events, what noise do I need to be aware of going on that I need to report on, that I need to keep abreast of as I'm going through. And then I think the last point, I think corporates, this is a less easy one, but they have to understand when enough is enough. When is too much pain? When do you start just to get to the point where you have to hand back the keys in effect? And it's easy for the water industry in inverted commas, because when we get to the point of no return, we hand our keys back to the regulator or the government, and we say, actually, it's now your job, we can do no more. I mean, there'll be ramifications of that in terms of directors facing the judicial system, but there has to be a point where we say, actually, as a private entity, we can no longer support water and sewage systems to the general public, and someone needs to step in. That won't necessarily be the case always for all companies. You know, we're a slightly special case along with the energy industry. But there has to be a way to transfer our customers across. We have to know, again, parts of our business, how we move those parts of the business to a different entity, and whether that's breaking up the company in a more sort of normal corporate structure or what. But how do we get to the point where actually the company is still viable, it's just much smaller or in smaller pieces, and we're able to transfer those pieces to organisations or to bodies that are able to run them for us and keep that service and the customer service going. Because I think that's a socially responsible thing to do. If you look at places like BHS as an easy target, I mean, you know, they went under, but the pension fund went with it. There has to be a point as a company where you say, actually, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let the pension fund get to that state, so we're no longer solvent, but the pension fund is in a state where actually we're able to ensure that the people that put into that fund and the people that worked for this company are still going to get a decent pension when they're no longer of working age. And I think that's a sensible thing to do as a specific example, but there are other parts of the operation that also need to work in that way. So I guess my conclusions on this is that it's a little bit of a different way of looking at it. Instead of looking at business continuity or crisis management, we're actually looking at the full resilience plan, and not just financial resilience, but operational resilience. And it's the key workings of that is working out what your business actually does and what are the key things that it needs to be aware of. And the key things that it needs to keep on doing. You need to understand really what your options are should things go wrong. And you need to have those plans in place before that event occurs. And they need to be tested. So I've got a great example from my former workplace, Centrica, where we had a bomb drill plan. But in the corporate HQ at the time was the trading wing. So we had 24/7 traders on the commodity markets. And the argument always was that you would never do the bomb test because you'd have to take those people out of the office. And as soon as they go out of the office, the sort of the artificial intelligence, for want of a better phrase, kicks in, and they start playing the markets for the company instead, against defined rules. So the company, in effect, will lose a bit of money potentially because of that, because you haven't got the human interface working the markets, and then you've got to move those people a mile or so up the road, all congregate, do a roll call, take them back in, and it's not a proper event, it's just a drill. So no one would ever say, actually, this is something we should do. There's a strong enough argument to stop business, move out, and bring back in the space of a sort of an hour or 2 hours. Until they did test it, because someone eventually said, actually, we do need to test this. At some point, the bomb threat was such, 2012 Olympics, we were a big corporate HQ next to an Olympic rowing site, that actually we do need to test it just to make sure it works. And when they got out onto the road, they found the pavement was too narrow for 1,500 people to walk up a couple of miles up the road. And that brought it home is that if there had been a bomb attack, if there was a real bomb, we would have struggled with with the safety of our employees to actually get them out of the office, up the road against a 40-mile-an-hour traffic intercourse coming the other way. So we punched a hole in the back fence and went out into Windsor Racecourse instead. But again, if you don't test these things, you won't know. So if you have a crisis management plan in place, you won't know it works until the event, if you're not going to test it. And testing is key. It stops it becoming a tick box exercise. It stops you having crisis management plans. It stops you having your corporate blueprints that map out what your organisation does, just sticking on the shelf, gathering dust, waiting for the event. I think these things have to be more proactive. You have to have a culture of proactivity to actually go out, test, make sure it works, evolve, and keep on going. And the very last thing is just to remember you're not too big to fail. There are too many corporates out there, too many organisations that have been hit by catastrophic events or whatever. Oxfam, another big one, huge scandal over in Haiti. And as a result, they lost their government funding. It's for an organisation like that, huge. But think of the consequences of that, because it wasn't just the fact that you had people that had the wrong ethics culture within that company, but the ramifications of Oxfam no longer getting the funding to be able to do the work that the rest of the company were doing in a more ethical manner means that parts of the world are poorer as a result. So we need to make sure that we have resilience systems in place to allow us to navigate exactly where the company needs to go and to ensure that it still remains corporately responsible. Thank you.